Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and after spending 40 weeks of Third Age Thursdays doing deep dives into the poetry and songs from The Lord of the Rings, we finally moved on to something else last week, starting a series looking at Middle-earth artifacts that show up in the Third Age. And we began with two swords that suggest both Thorin and Gandalf rolled multiple natural 20s in a row on the loot chart, Glamdring and Orcrist. Man, if I'm the DM, I am not letting him get those swords. You got to be kidding me. This week, let's see what we know about the dagger that Bilbo picked up. Now, last week, we read the passage where Bilbo found the knife, right after Gandalf and Thorin naturally took the best swords for themselves. And Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for the hobbit. And that's all we get of it for a while. Elrond doesn't say a word about it when he speaks about the history of Glamdring and Orcrist, and it doesn't even appear in the story again until Bilbo finds himself separated from the dwarves in the goblin tunnels. But in slapping all his pockets and feeling all round himself for matches, his hand came on the hilt of his little sword, the little dagger that he got from the trolls and that he had quite forgotten, nor fortunately had the goblins noticed it as he wore it inside his breeches. Now he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it is an elvish blade too, he thought, and goblins are not very near, and yet not far enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin for the goblin wars of which so many songs had sung. Now, the faint glimmer from the sword did give Bilbo just enough light to navigate by, until he encountered Gollum, who became quite polite when he saw the blade. But it remained unnamed until well into Mirkwood, when Baggins found himself in a desperate fight with a giant spider. He beat the creature off with his hands. It was trying to poison him to keep him quiet, as small spiders do to flies, until he remembered his sword and drew it out. Then the spider jumped back, and he had time to cut his legs loose. After that, it was his turn to attack. The spider evidently was not used to things that carried such stings at their sides, or it would have hurried away quicker. Bilbo came at it before it could disappear and stuck it with his sword right in the eyes. Then it went mad and leaped and danced and flung out its legs in horrible jerks until he killed it with another stroke. And then he fell down and remembered nothing more for a long while. There was the usual dim gray light of the forest day about him when he came to his senses. The spider lay dead beside him, and his sword blade was stained black. Somehow, the killing of the giant spider, all alone by himself in the dark, without the help of the wizard or the dwarves or of anyone else, made a great difference to Mr. Baggins. He felt a different person, and much fiercer and bolder in spite of an empty stomach, as he wiped his sword on the grass and put it back into its sheath. "I will give you a name," he said to it, "and I shall call you Sting." And the legend was born. Unlike the other two blades from Gondolin, this one had no known history until Bilbo gave it a history and a name. Now, after his journey there and back again, Bilbo hung Sting over his fireplace and then took it with him when he left the Shire on September 22nd, Third Age 3001. It stayed with him in Rivendell for 17 years before he gave it to Frodo. He took from the box a small sword in an old shabby leather scabbard. Then he drew it, and its polished and well-tended blade glittered suddenly, cold and bright. "This is Sting," he said, and thrust it with little effort deep into a wooden beam. "Take it if you like. I shan't want it again, I expect." Frodo accepted it gratefully. Good thing he did, of course, as it helped bring Gollum under his control. And then later in Shelob's lair, Frodo was able to hew the webs. The blue gleaming blade shore through the webs like a scythe through grass, and they leaped and writhed and then hung loose. And then after Frodo had been paralyzed, Sam still stood upon his feet, and dropping his own sword, with both hands he held the elven blade point upwards, fending off that ghastly roof. And so Shelob, with the driving force of her own cruel will, with strength greater than any warrior's hand, thrust herself upon a bitter spike. Deep, deep it pricked, as Sam was crushed slowly to the ground. Later, Frodo gave Sting to Sam in Mordor. "But Sting I give to you. I have got an orc blade, but I do not think it will be my part to strike any blow again." Frodo would then reiterate this gift on the field of Cormallen, though he would concede to wear it and the mithril coat one more time at the celebration. That's the last we hear of it, so it would have remained with Sam when Frodo left the Grey Havens. But did Sam take it with him when he departed for the Undying Lands in 4th Age 61? Or did it remain with Elenor and become an heirloom of the Gardner family? Tolkien is silent on that. I will say that I love that we see the story of Sting develop over both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Now, I'm sure it did something useful in Gondolin. Perhaps it belonged to an archer who used it for close-in work, as it was too small to use as a real sword. But it didn't have a legend until it came into the hands of a hobbit, Bilbo Baggins. Now, I had honestly hoped to find time to dive into the story of the Arkenstone in this episode. Silly me, thinking that talking about Sting wouldn't take up the whole thing. So next week, we'll take a fascinating look at the heart of the mountain, the Arkenstone. But for now, folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. Be sure to come back tomorrow as we continue the story of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin on First Age Friday. Check out patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support this show, get an ad-free feed, bonus weekly episode, and more. And podcast listeners, please be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast apps. For those on YouTube, subscribe to the channel to get all of the BPP productions. And everybody, be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.